Welcome back. We're going to take a look in this video, or this lesson here, on some of the events that actually led up to the armed conflict of the war between the states. So we're going to take a look at key events during the 1850s. So for your notes, it'll be fairly simple. You'll need to write down a year from that decade, and then write down what happened and why that event was important. We'll start with the year 1850. It was in the year 1850 that they made what they call sometimes the Great Compromise, and in this compromise they passed what was known as the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act was fairly simple. Prior to the Fugitive Slave Act, if you were a slave who ran away from your farm or plantation, ran away from your master that is, if you escaped into a state that was free, by law, you essentially could be kept free. You could simply live there, and your master didn't necessarily have any right to get you back unless that state demanded that you be sent back. Well, the Fugitive Slave Law made it so that if you escaped across the Ohio River, for example, into Illinois, which was a free state, that really didn't mean you were free, because the state of Illinois, along with all of its government agencies, such as the police or the sheriff, for example, had to actually find you and send you back to your master by law. So this actually created things like the Underground Railroad, which was a series of abolitionists throughout the South and the North who helped fugitive slaves escape, but they had to keep them hidden, and they would often have them travel at night from one house or one barn or one church to another until they made their way all the way to Canada, where they could not be brought back by the Fugitive Slave Law. Well, even though this law was designed to promote slavery in a certain way, the whole point of this was that the federal government was trying to say that they didn't have a right to end this. It was up to the states themselves to end it. That was the whole point of that law. And the unifiers, Calhoun, Webster, and Clay, helped get this law established. Now, this year is also important because in this year, John C. Calhoun died. And when he died, one of the great voices in the Senate, one of the great men who really kept the people who were angry with each other, those fire breathers and those radical Republicans in the two different camps, kind of kept them on the fringe, he passes. So a key voice and a key issue of compromise goes away at this time. Now, the next date I want you to write down is 1852. It was in 1852 that a novel, one of the great classics in American history, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was published. This was a book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it really was a story about what slavery looks like in the South. Now, she herself was the daughter of a radical abolitionist pastor up in the North. And what's interesting about her story, by the way, is an incredibly well-written tale. It really is a classic of American thought, and really just a good novel overall. But what's curious about her work is her work was really used, especially in the North, to give people an impression of what slavery looked like in the South, which of course was always negative. We're not so much talking about the idea that it was morally wrong for people to own others. We're talking about the idea that she spread this concept that all slaves were horrifically treated, which was sometimes true, but not always true. And so, one observer said that her novel was true in all of its facts. All the facts that she gave were accurate. But he also said it was false in all of its impressions. In other words, the way that she described the culture and described the attitudes of people really was not quite accurate. It typically turned the South into a complete villain, which wasn't quite true. The same year of 1852 also saw the deaths of both Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, which means that all three of the unifiers are gone now. The next year I want you to write down is 1854. It was in 1854 that the Congress passed what was known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which actually overturned the Missouri Compromise. If you remember, the Missouri Compromise made it so that any new states that came into the Union that were north or south of the 36.5-degree parallel, if they were north, they'd be free. If they were south, they would be slave states. It was designed to maintain a balance of power. It really didn't comment much on the whole moral issue of slavery, which was a problem, but that wasn't the point. Even so, what the Kansas-Nebraska Act actually did was it made it so that each of the new states got to decide by popular vote whether or not they would be slave or free. Well, because there was such division between North and South, people actually raced to these states that were either pro-slavery or anti-slavery and tried to establish dominance in the state so that when the election came around, they would win that state for their cause. And it really was about power and control of power. Well, states such as Kansas, because these people weren't always afraid to use violence against their own neighbors, became known as places such as Bleeding Kansas, as the Jayhawks, who were anti-slavery, fought against the Bushwhackers, who were pro-slavery. These were just different people groups who came into Kansas trying to establish their politics there. But again, this created such a mess that it caused the federal government to look at how they should actually solve these problems. Another issue that we can't ignore is the fact that many of these lands, particularly Kansas and Nebraska, had already been promised to the natives as being forever held by the natives. And in fact, we violated original treaties with native nations when we actually created these states. The next year you need to write down is 1856. This is when things get really ugly in Washington, D.C. Charles Sumner, that great senator from Massachusetts, that radical abolitionist, and this year he gave a speech in which he attacked the character of a senator from South Carolina. His name was Senator Butler. And he didn't just attack the character of him, he accused him of all kinds of immoral acts with slaves back home in such a way that Butler's honor felt completely violated. And so the nephew of Butler, a man by the name of Preston Brooks, who also came from South Carolina, who was actually a representative in the House, decided he would take matters into his own hands, and so he approached Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate, raised his cane, and beat him no less than 30 times, while the other senators watched. Those who were friends with Sumner watched in horror. Those who hated Sumner laughed. Both men went home after this. Sumner went home. He actually was essentially in bed, suffering from his injuries for roughly 2 years. Actually never completely recovered from this incident. And he was seen as a martyr and a hero for the people who agreed with him. Preston Brooks went home to South Carolina. In fact, the House tried to expel him for attacking someone violently, but didn't get enough votes to expel him. That shows you how many people believed he was right. He, though, retired, went home to South Carolina, and was actually sent several letters congratulating him and rewarding him with new canes for the fact that he had beaten Sumner over this issue. So if you want to take a look at a single story that highlights the division in the nation at this time over things such as the political power struggle in Washington, D.C., it really is this story because both men were seen as heroes. The following year, 1857, a very important yet little-known book comes out. The book's title was called The Impending Crisis in the South. And it was written by a North Carolina man named Hinton Helper. And this was a book that was about slavery. It's very interesting how Helper viewed things. He wrote this book to the common middle class or yeoman farmer in the South. And he said that slavery would ultimately destroy the South because it destroyed work ethic. After all, if you own someone and they do all the work you don't want to do for you, and you can actually increase the number of people that you own and eventually not do any work or do very little work on your own, then it tends to take away a whole virtue of working for your own bread, of working for your own sustenance. And so he argued that this really would destroy the South because of this very same issue. In fact, he argued that the reason why the South did not have as much wealth or as many factories as the North did was because they lacked this work ethic and they lacked the pursuit of innovation, and especially it was immoral because it was at the cost of another's liberty. Of course, the book was widely ignored, even though he called upon Southern yeomen to establish plans to abolish slavery. Now, throughout the 1850s, we begin to see several plans in the South of how slavery could actually end. And not just ending slavery, but what would happen to the Africans afterwards. Some, of course, thought, well, they can go back to Africa. which was never really practical. And some said, no, why can't they just stay on if they want to stay on and earn a living wage with their present master, if the relationship was actually good, which sometimes it was. Even so, the problem is these plans never actually became established. In fact, what we see at this point is because North and South are so suspicious of each other, they both saw themselves as having the right answer, and they both saw themselves as being righteous. The North being the righteous avenger, and the South being the righteous defender. And so really, because they hardened themselves against each other, nothing came out of this. No solutions were actually established. But there's a few more dates we need to look at before we end this talk. And the next one is 1858. There are two events I want you to note that happened in 1858. The first is the infamous Dred Scott case. The Dred Scott case involved a slave by the same name, and this slave, Dred Scott, had been taken by his master for a lengthy period of time into a free state. And so he argued that because he was in a free state for so long and had actually been brought into a place where slavery was illegal but still used as a slave, that he should be granted his freedom. And so he actually filed a lawsuit against the widow of his master, who had died by this time, suing for his freedom. Eventually, the case came to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that they really could not rule on this because they did not see Dred Scott as a citizen. Because he was a slave, he was not a citizen of the United States. But curiously, that meant he wasn't a citizen of any nation. So it essentially meant that he had no legal rights and essentially no legal protections. And so it may have been designed to try and prevent slavery from being a bigger issue, but it actually made slavery into a bigger problem because it showed that African slaves essentially had nothing to look forward to. They had no real freedoms, and that, of course, is always dangerous. The second thing that happened in 1858 was a little-known former congressman from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln gave a famous speech at a Republican convention. The Republicans were a new party at this time, or a newish party at this time. And in this speech, which is famously known as his House Divided speech, he called for union. He called for the Union to maintain its identity and especially to maintain unity. When the South looked at this, they saw it as a threat against their way of life because they knew that most of the political things that Lincoln stood for were against their actual culture. But that still just added fuel to the fire. The final event I'll give you happened in 1859. It was in 1859 that John Brown, who I mentioned previously, actually performed his raid against Harper's Ferry in an attempt to arm slaves in the Virginia area to rise up violently against their masters and essentially win their freedom by force. He was actually stopped and he was executed, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, that great transcendentalist, said that John Brown would make the gallows, that which you actually get hung on, as glorious as the cross. In other words, he really was seen as a Christ-like figure, someone of great martyrdom. In other words, what we see here is we see a very emotional story pressing forward, and we see very little justice happening on either side. That is the tragedy of the war between the states, which would be a war of brother against brother.